Good evening and welcome back to Empty Cloud Monastery. This evening we're honored to have with us Aya Soma. And this evening we'll be talking about one of the Buddhist discourses. So the Dutya Lokadhamma Sutta from the Anguttara Nikaya, which is a discourse on the 8 worldly conditions or 8 worldly phenomena. So maybe we can begin by paying homage to the Buddha. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato Samma Sambuddhassa. Buddhang Dhammang Sanghang Namasami. So we can invite Aya Soma to introduce the topic and get the conversation going.
Okay, well, thank you, Bante. I'm going to actually, instead of introducing the topic, I'm just going to read directly from the Pali Canon. So we can start by reading the words of the Buddha and then discuss from there. So if you want to follow along, it's Anguttara Nikaya 8.6. And I will be reading from Venerable Bhikkhu Bodhi's translation. So the sutta begins saying, monastics, these 8 worldly conditions revolve around the world, and the world revolves around these 8 worldly conditions. What 8? Gain and loss, disrepute and fame, blame and praise, and pleasure and pain. These 8 worldly conditions revolve around the world, and the world revolves around these 8 worldly conditions. An uninstructed worldling meets gain and loss, disrepute and fame, blame and praise, and pleasure and pain. An instructed noble disciple also meets gain and loss, disrepute and fame, blame and praise, and pleasure and pain. What is the distinction, the disparity, the difference between an instructed noble disciple and an uninstructed worldling with regard to this? So without having the spoiler answer, I invite all of you to type in the answer to this to this question, because it's actually very interesting. I think that whenever the Buddha is asking a question, we hear the Buddha asking a question in the suttas, it's actually very good to see what we would be answering. So then we can compare it to the actual Samma Ditti that comes afterwards, when the Buddha actually gives us the sort of the answer to the question. But it's actually important, I think, to really contemplate that and to really see what do we think is the answer to this. But before we actually get to the answer, I would say that it's interesting. Actually, I want to invite Bante to see perhaps the Pali, and maybe if you want to actually talk about just the 8 worldly conditions that the Buddha is talking about, so we kind of have a bit of an understanding.
Yeah, so first off, the 8 conditions, they come as 4 pairs. So the first one is labo and alabo. So labo means gain or acquisition. And alabo is non-gain, non-acquisition. So I believe they translates that as gain and loss. Mm-hmm. So alabo doesn't necessarily mean loss. It just means non-gain. So not acquiring things or not gaining things. And this could be gains of any sort, but usually in the suttas, labha has the meaning of material possession, material acquisition, material wealth of some kind. So whether objects or finances or material things. The second pair is yaso and ayaso. So yasa has the meaning of glory or can mean fame. And ayaso similarly means non-glory, non-fame. So yasa also has the meaning of good reputation. So then ayasa means not having a good reputation. Or yasa in its meaning of fame. So ayasa would mean not having fame. So not being well known or renowned. So here it's translated as fame and disrepute. Disrepute is the meaning of like a bad reputation, whereas ayasa doesn't necessarily mean a bad reputation, but rather a lack of a good reputation. So not being well known or not being known in a good way, a positive way. And then the next pair is ninda and pasangsa. So ninda, on the other hand, actually does have a very distinctly negative meaning. So ninda means to be blamed or criticized. And pasangsa, on the other hand, means to be praised. So ninda is blame or criticism, and pasangsa is praise, to be condoned or respected, praised. And then the last pair is sukha and dukkha, which is quite simply pleasure and pain, or comfort and discomfort. So these are this is actually the most clear and straightforward, so pleasure and pain. So briefly, that's these 8 conditions, these 8 things which we all experience. So again, as Ayasoma was saying, the Buddha is asking, what's the difference if both awakened beings and unawakened beings both experience these 8 conditions? What's the difference between these 2 kinds of beings? And I see a couple comments. So Denise answers, awareness of pain, pleasure, fame, disrepute, etc., and not identifying with those conditions. I assume that's for the awakened being.
Yeah, the distinction between how an awakened being and a non-awakened being are experiencing these conditions, which is very interesting, that the Buddha highlights also the fact that essentially whether we're awakened or not awakened, we're still having, essentially to deal with the same sort of conditions. But what is it that actually changes? So Denise's answer is not identifying with all of these conditions.
And also awareness of them. So being aware of them and not identifying with them.
Yeah, very important.
And Karen gives a different answer. Karen says, seeing the worldly conditions as inconstant, stressful, and subject to change. So I assume that's anicca, dukkha, and viparinama. So anicca, impermanent, dukkha, unsatisfactory, and viparinama, subject to change. Yeah.
Excellent. All right. I think that now it's the end of the Dhamma talk because you're very, very good practitioners. But yeah, that was basically the sort of TikTok Dhamma talk version. Your 2 comments, both Denise and Karen. But yeah, it's very interesting. Once again, sometimes we can think of like how back in the day, 2,500 years ago, in ancient India, people were experiencing a sort of different state of the world, different struggles, different, not kind of like these days. Today we live in this modern world with all of these different struggles, etc. And is it really that different? So yeah, gain and non-gain, as Bhante was saying. I mean, it's pretty much a constant in this world as well, like constantly wanting to accumulate more and suffering because one is actually losing the accumulation or not being capable of accumulating things. Similarly to fame and non-fame. I mean, we're in the, especially like these days in the, before I think it was the 15 minutes of fame. Now we are like in the 1 second of fame. And, like with social media, everybody's somewhat like sort of famous. And so there's this constant search for followers, this constant search for notoriety. Is that how you say it in English? Notoriety. Yeah. And that's suffering if one doesn't have enough followers on Instagram, enough followers on Facebook or whatever, or TikTok or whatever it is that we think. And so that kind of constantly going there. And of course, then the blame and praise, how we suffer between when people are saying bad things about us, and instead when we feel very much full of ourselves, when instead things kind of start changing. When they were like, oh, Ayasoma, she's such a great, monastic or great practitioner, and I'm like, oh yeah, that's great. Thank you. And then when people are like, oh, Ayasoma is a terrible practitioner, terrible monastic, then sadness comes in. So whatever it is, whether we're monastics or lay people, whether we're male, female, transgender, it doesn't matter. We're all kind of subject to this. We're very attached to what other people are saying or not saying about us. And then, of course, pleasure and pain. This, give me more pleasure, give me less pain. So essentially not really different these days, the experience of the world that we're having than back then. And so we see that also kind of timeless aspect of the Dhamma, timeless characteristic of the Dhamma. Maybe we can then keep reading on that.
Yeah.
And so the monastics, when the Buddha gives that teaching, contrarily to Denise and Karen, who answered straight away, the monastics are like, okay, actually, Bhante, please tell us the answer. So if you can clear it up for us, that would be great. And so the Buddha replies and says, monastics, when an uninstructed worldling meets with gain, they do not reflect thus. This gain that I have met is impermanent, suffering, and subject to change. They do not understand it as it really is. When they're met with loss, fame, disrepute, blame, praise, pleasure, pain, they do not reflect thus. This pain that I have met is impermanent, suffering, and subject to change. They do not understand it as it really is. Gain obsesses their mind, and loss obsesses their mind. Fame obsesses their mind, and disrepute obsesses their mind. Blame obsesses their mind, and praise obsesses their mind. Pleasure obsesses their mind, and pain obsesses their mind. They're attracted to gain and repelled by loss. They're attracted to fame and repelled by disrepute. They're attracted to praise and repelled by blame. They're attracted to pleasure and repelled by pain. Thus involved with attraction and repulsion, they are not freed from birth, from old age and death, from sorrow, lamentation, pain, dejection, and anguish. They're not freed from suffering, I say. Sounds familiar?
And sometimes reading the suttas is like looking in a mirror. And so, I find this really notable. So again, first off, the Buddha is pointing out that the ordinary person is not recognizing that these conditions are anicca, dukkha, and viparinama, not recognizing that they're impermanent. So there's a tendency, like when we're in pain, we just fixate on the pain, not recognizing that it's a temporary experience. Or conversely, like if we get something really pleasant, something really nice, like maybe somebody gives us a really nice bag of tea, and we're not reflecting on the fact that it's temporary. It's eventually going to run out. It's going to be lost. So we get obsessed with it. We get caught up in these things because we don't recognize their impermanence. So we take them too seriously. And also we think like, oh, at last I have my source of happiness. And we don't recognize that there's no true happiness to be found in these temporary, unreliable experiences. And also getting caught up in the unpleasant side of things. Well, we don't recognize that, for example, if you lose something, you haven't actually lost anything valuable. You've just lost some dukkha. You've just lost something that's dukkha. Or if you don't get what you want, well, it's not like you've missed out on anything. You're just not getting something that's dukkha. So then, but since we don't see it in these ways, then we're thinking like, yes, I got something great. Or like, oh, I didn't get something great. I got something less good. And also viparinama, the subject to change. So not recognizing that whatever condition we're currently in is subject to change, and therefore it doesn't define our existence. It doesn't define our being. And so the Buddha says then we get obsessed with these 8 things. And the term translated as obsessed. So it's chittang parayadaya tittati. So chittang means mind. Parayadaya means to surround or encompass. So the prefix pari means all around. So paryadaya means to go completely around something. And titati means to remain or stand firm. So these things become solidly set in completely surrounding and engulfing the mind. So that this is what the mind is constantly fixating on. It's constantly rolling around in these 8 things, constantly thinking about how can I get more gain and how can I avoid loss? How can I get more good reputation and avoid loss of reputation? How can I get more praise and less criticism? How can I get more pleasure and less pain? The mind is constantly engulfed by this way of thinking. And because we're constantly engulfed in this way of thinking, then as the Buddha says, then we're constantly caught up in desire and aversion, which means we're never going to get free of the cycle of suffering as long as we're caught in this way of thinking.
Thank you, Bhante. Yes, another thing that comes to mind is how essentially, it's so connected to vipallasa, so our distortions of perception, essentially, where we are constantly perceiving that everything that we're experiencing is permanent. And that whether, for example, we are gaining something, like we are either gaining, like we have, for example, a house, or we have a family, or we have a relationship, and we take it for granted that is basically permanent, that is how it's going to be, that is how it is, and it's solid, it's concrete. And that experience, even though it's quote unquote, we would say positive, maybe we're quite happy about having that experience, it obsesses our mind. Like it really takes foothold of our mind, of our basically that's the only experience that we're having. And conversely, if we are losing this, for example, if we're breaking up from a relationship, or our family is dismembered, or the house is taken from us for whatever reason, also going through that experience of loss, when we're going through it, it can have some really strong effects on the mind of depression. So we also take that for permanent. We always, like anything that we're experiencing has that power. I feel like the obsession, that the obsession is basically the synonym essentially of distortion of view, of like taking everything as permanent, which I feel like also the experience perhaps of depression has that sort of connotation of not seeing a way out, because we are completely oblivious of the impermanence of whatever that we're experiencing, and of it being subject to change. Yeah, so the bad is also like what we don't like. Also, the pain is subject to change, and the pleasure is subject to change. But as we go through these changing emotions, our experience is always of permanence, which is distorted and creates more dukkha. Isn't it bizarre? It's just really bizarre how we're so disconnected from things. And we have some.
And there's another comment here from Denise. So Denise says, these worldly conditions are experienced in every sphere: work, family, friendships. Our very society teaches us to move close or away from each of these. Sometimes it is very difficult to spot them. Yeah, this is true. This is true. So one of the challenging things about Buddhist practice is that Buddhist practice is going against many of what's considered normal behavior. And this is because so-called normal behaviors are often actually not strategies for cultivating happiness and wisdom, but rather they're things which just keep us constantly enmeshed in this pursuit of gain, pleasure, praise, and so on, which keep us constantly pursuing pleasure and avoiding pain, constantly pursuing praise and avoiding criticism, and so on. So it is interesting when we encounter Dhamma practice, and the Buddha is giving us a different perspective. So the Buddha is not saying, by the way, that we then need to actively seek out pain and blame and so on. but rather he's saying that we should acknowledge that these 8 things are simply a normal part of life. That experiencing these 8 things is just part of what it means to be a sentient being. And the problem is not these 8 phenomena themselves, but rather it's the obsession that we have with them. And it's this relentless urge to try to pursue 4 of these while avoiding the other 4 of them, which is ultimately futile because they all come together. It's all a package deal. So instead, what we're trying to do is to see them in their true nature, to recognize that these are anicca, dukkha, viparinama, that these are impermanent, unsatisfying, and subject to change. So that, and also that they're completely natural and that they don't define who we are. They're impersonal aspects of nature. So it's not something that we need to take personally. So like if Ayasoma gets praised more than I do, well, I don't need to take that personally. That's just an aspect of reality, that sometimes that's how it is. Or if the cat gets praised more than Ayasoma, well, I mean, it's kind of silly if Ayasoma takes that personally. I mean, it's just the way it is. Everyone loves cats more than people. I mean, it's just natural. So we don't need to take these things personally. And when we don't take them personally, then they have no ability to disrupt our happiness or disrupt our peace of mind.
The cat story is a true story. The Ayasoma being praised more is not a true story. All right, and then we can end the sutta by recollecting how instead a noble disciple essentially experiences these conditions. When an instructed noble disciple meets with gain, fame, loss, disrepute, blame, praise, pleasure, etc., they reflect thus: what I have met is impermanent, suffering, and subject to change. They understand it as it really is. Very simple, to the point.
Yeah.
Gain does not obsess their mind, and loss does not obsess their mind. Fame does not obsess their mind, and disrepute does not obsess their mind. Blame does not obsess their mind, and praise does not obsess their mind. Pleasure does not obsess their mind, and pain does not obsess their mind. They are not attracted to gain or repelled by loss. They're not attracted to fame or repelled by disrepute. They're not attracted to praise or repelled by blame. They're not attracted to pleasure or repelled by pain. Having thus discarded attraction and repulsion, they're freed from birth, from old age and death, from sorrow, lamentation, pain, dejection, and anguish. They're freed from suffering, I say. This, monastics, is the distinction, the disparity, the difference between an uninstructed noble disciple.
No, between uninstructed
noble disciple and an uninstructed worldling. There you go. Thank you. All right. We can respect the sutta with 3 sadhus.
Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. Okay.
Right. If there are any other comments or perhaps questions, feel free to type them in the chat. And I don't know if Mate, you have any other thoughts?
Yeah, well, and I think that again, it's important to consider how we experience these 8 conditions in our daily life and to see how the mind reacts to them. So one of the stories from Ajahn Chah, which I find quite cute, was in the very early days when Ajahn Sumedho was first being allowed to give Dhamma talks. Ajahn Sumedho gave one of his first talks, and afterwards the other monks were praising him like, "Oh, that was a great talk. You did really well. It was really good." And Ajahn Sumedho was like, "Yeah, yes, it's true. It's true. I'm great." And Ajahn Chah saw this, and Ajahn Chah was like, "Okay, you're giving another Dhamma talk tomorrow." But then this time, the entire time that Ajahn Sumedho was talking, Ajahn Chah was making fun of him. Like in front of the whole group of lay people, Ajahn Chah kept saying things like, God, these foreign monks smell really bad. And like Ajahn Sumedho would say something and Ajahn Chah would be like, wow, this guy's an idiot. He doesn't know what he's talking about. And it was just constant, except the whole time, poor Ajahn Sumedho was so embarrassed and infuriated, and people were laughing at him. And then finally, after the talk, Ajahn Chah went up to him and was like, praise and blame, eh? And in that moment, Ajahn Sumedho realized like it was communicating a point about how even when we hear these Dhamma teachings, in actuality, we become intoxicated with praise. When we experience praise, we're just like, oh, it's true, I'm so great. Yes, please worship me, that's true, I'm awesome. And then when we experience blame, well, we also get intoxicated, but in a negative way. Like, oh, God, this hurts so much. They're saying nasty things about me. Ouch. Make it stop. But in actuality, what is it? In the Tibetan tradition, they call these the 8 winds. So sometimes the wind blows from the north and sometimes it blows from the south. It's just the wind. But we don't make a big deal like, oh no, the wind is blowing from the north today. What a catastrophe. Or, hurrah, the wind is blowing from the south. It's like, oh, that's just the wind. Sometimes it blows from the north, the south, the east, the west. That's just the nature of the wind, as it blows from different directions at different times. So in the same way, it's just the nature of the world that we experience these 8 conditions from time to time. So then our challenge is to be clearly aware of the condition arising and to notice if we do have a tendency to become intoxicated or overwhelmed by them. And constantly trying to return the mind to this serene, peaceful, equanimous acknowledgement that this is just a natural phenomenon. It's completely impersonal. And if we let ourselves get swept up in it, then we'll just experience dukkha. And it's completely unnecessary. And I see now there's a bunch of questions which have appeared. So maybe we can look at some of these questions.
I think that Linda's
there. Okay, so here Linda says, I find with more practice the mental habit patterns responding to the worldly winds still arise, but I believe them much less. Someone said something challenging to me today, but I could watch them and not believe so much.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for sharing that, Linda. Yeah, I think that's basically one of the sort of, if not immediate gifts of the path, the gifts of the Dhamma. Definitely, it happens early on, and we see, and we have that glimpse of cessation of suffering, right? That it doesn't hurt as much as it does. And we also stop taking things as personally as we used to do. And we kind of like are like, oh, okay, yeah, that is really annoying, that they're praising Bhante Sudaso more than myself. But before maybe we're like, oh, they're praising him more, and we're actually not even slowing down the moment and actually making the acknowledgement that this is what is going on, but rather we're perhaps sometimes moved to act based on that really unpleasant feeling of being overlooked, perhaps, right? And we start believing it, and then there's that story that starts obsessing the mind, like, oh, look at that, the people hate me. No, they're all obsessed with him, and it's because of this and this other reason, and why are they obsessed with him? They should be obsessed with me, etc. And like it can build up so much that then we act unskillfully. But as we practice and we start slowing down this process, then we start seeing, oh, there is this thing happening. And yeah, I think we're getting in the realm of the Anangana Sutta, where the Buddha essentially encourages us to really look at the stains of the mind, really look at the blemishes, at the imperfections, and acknowledge them. And also, conversely, to go like, oh, actually, they're praising Bhante Sudaso more and not me, and I'm actually not taking offense at all. It's like completely okay. That's great. Oh, let me keep this, there is no blemish there. Let me keep it as it is. this feels actually a lot better than when instead the mind is there like, oh, I want more, give me that praise, give me that pleasant feeling. And so as we slow down the process, of course the habit will still be there, but we become a little bit more cool, which is essentially the meaning of nibbana. It's like we're cooling it off, so we're kind of like getting more taste of nibbana, cooling it off, which is quite pleasant. And we see how real, how true the teachings of the Buddha are. So yeah, thanks for sharing that. And Bhante, do you have any reflections to share on that as well?
Well, I think we have a few more questions and comments. So I think we can keep going. So Sud asks, where does such equanimity come from in a noble disciple? Well, as the Buddha says, it comes from reflecting, well, first off, seeing things as they are. So seeing these 8 conditions as they are, and seeing them as anicca, dukkha, viparinama. So as impermanent, unsatisfying, and subject to change. So when we see these 8 experiences in this way, then naturally the mind becomes less fixated on them, less intoxicated with them, which makes it easier to remain in equanimity. So recognizing that when we get swept up in these things, then naturally we suffer more. And when we don't get swept up in these things, then we don't suffer. So it's this, the Buddha gives the prescription right here. It's recognizing the experience that's happening as impermanent, unsatisfying, subject to change, recognizing it as natural, as impersonal, as not worth obsessing about, not worth fixating on, just another temporary experience to be aware of. So that's where this equanimity comes from. And of course, it's supported by the Eightfold Path. So it's supported by practicing Sila, Samadhi, and Panya. It's supported by cultivating kindness, by cultivating mindfulness, by cultivating concentration, by cultivating right view. All of these things support our ability to be faced with something like praise and blame or pleasure and pain and not be swept away by it. So all the different parts of the path fit together. So any one particular part might seem challenging, but when it's supported by the other aspects of the practice, it becomes easier. Anything else?
No, that's perfect.
Okay, and Differences Spreading says, I heard Ajahn Brahmali speak of a sutta in which an evil spirit tested the Buddha by being spiky. The Buddha moved away from the spirit, saying it is the nature of all beings to move away from pain. And the movement away from suffering is what leads us to the path. Well, first off, I suspect that he was talking about the story of Suchi Loma, but I actually just did a quick search and was having a hard time finding the exact sutta reference. So if you were interested, you could track down that particular sutta and send it to us and we can talk about it. But there is the story, which I don't recall exactly where it is in the suttas, but there's a spirit which was painful to the touch. And think about like a sea urchin. If a sea urchin is getting close to you, then naturally you're going to pull back from it, just because you don't want the body to be damaged. So the Buddha had a physical body, and the Buddha, for the most part, kept that physical body in reasonably good condition. So the Buddha would not deliberately damage that body. That was actually one of his realizations while he was practicing to become awakened, is he realized that deliberately inflicting pain on the body is not useful. It's not productive. And so keeping the body in relatively good condition is it's not necessary for awakening, but it's helpful. So yeah, if a being was doing something that was threatening the health of the Buddha's body, then of course the Buddha would move back. That's not surprising. But the Buddha would do so with a completely calm mind. And possibly even with a compassionate mind of not wanting that being to incur the terribly bad karma of physically injuring a Buddha. And as for your statement, the movement away from suffering is what leads us to the path. Actually, that's quite true. So fundamentally, Buddhism is about freedom from dukkha. It's about progressing towards freedom from dukkha. And at some point, we recognize that the pursuit of pleasure, the pursuit of praise, the pursuit of good reputation, the pursuit of gain, these are things that we do thinking they will reduce our dukkha. But as our practice develops, we realize that the pursuit of these things, the obsession with these things, is itself a source of dukkha. So then in the wish to be free of dukkha, then we also wish to be free of obsession with these 8 worldly conditions. Okay.
No, many comments.
Oh, so differences spreading had some more things to say. Let's see. This being the case in the sutta, is it the case when pain arises and an enlightened being is not consumed by the pain, adding suffering? Is that also the case that an enlightened being might be able to dissolve it or work around it? Could some sit in a jhana instead? Do you want to speak about that? Or I can carry on,
yes,
since it's what I was just talking about. Yeah, so when pain arises in an enlightened being, they're not consumed by the pain. That's true. They would just recognize this is just a physical sensation. So they would not experience mental suffering. They would just recognize that there's a physical sensation happening in the body. But they wouldn't be bothered by it. They wouldn't be disturbed by those physical sensations. That said, if it is something which is injurious to the body, then they might move in order to prevent causing damage to their body. And would they be able to dissolve it or work around it? Yes. So an enlightened being can be fully aware of a painful sensation with equanimity. So to maintain perfect equanimity towards any painful sensation that arises. And yeah, someone who has good samadhi can also enter into samadhi, because when one is in jhana, there's no painful sensation. The mind experiences exclusively pleasant sensation, while in first, second, and third jhana. And in fourth jhana, the mind experiences exclusively equanimity. So yeah, cultivating samadhi is another way of dealing with physical pain. I've actually used this sometimes when I was feeling sick. So when the body was feeling sick or unpleasant, then doing meditation practice, it can be challenging in the beginning because one is facing a lot of unpleasant sensations. But once one's samadhi starts to build up, then the painful sensations tend to diminish. As the mind's samadhi becomes stronger, then also the equanimity becomes stronger. And the perception of the body starts to shift towards the pleasant. So yeah, samadhi is also a way that one can start to transform this experience. And you don't even have to be an enlightened being in order to do this. And Rick says, at the end of his life, the Buddha was able to be free of pain only when in deep meditation. How did he skillfully cope with intense pain when not in meditation?
Well, I mean, also the Buddha had stomach problems, renowned. I mean, he actually ultimately also died from a sort of kind of indigestion, you may call it, or food poisoning of sorts. Is that how you say it in English? Yeah. Yeah. So there's definitely, I think, like Bhante G says something that is really, with few words, kind of gives the point that pain is inevitable, suffering is not. So I feel like this is what this sutta is also addressing. So not being attracted to gain, or repelled by loss, or pleasure does not obsess the mind and pain does not obsess the mind, because this is essentially what's happening. like when we are experiencing unpleasant feelings, then back to what we were talking about earlier, we tend to think of them as permanent. And also the pleasant feelings, we tend to think of them as permanent. So it is constantly an experience of obsession. So my understanding is that then the Buddha would understand that these were transient. Ultimately, not obsessing towards, oh, I don't like this, I don't want this, it has to stop. And also, like, when not having that experience, not obsessing like, oh, this is great, this is wonderful, this is fantastic. I mean, it's not necessarily that we're actively engaging in those thoughts. For example, right now my body feels all right, but it's not that like my body is like, oh, my mind is like, oh, producing all these thoughts like, oh, this body is great, is great, is great. But there's kind of the sense that this is supposed to be the status quo, right? Like, even when we're experiencing neutral feelings, we're always shocked when there is sickness arising in the body. We're like, oh, what happened? I got a cold. Oh, that's crazy. And that's because when we feel a pleasant feeling, we feel it attached, but also when we feel a neutral feeling, we feel it attached. And when we feel an unpleasant feeling, we feel it attached. And this process of attachment is what essentially creates that experience of permanence, and that then disconnects with the experience with the reality of impermanence of all things. And so because we don't understand it experientially, we're constantly attached to pleasure and pain. We're constantly like in that domain. So yeah, of course the Buddha had a body just like ours, and of course, sometimes that body, especially in old age, was quite broken and challenged, but and challenging perhaps to function. I mean, it wasn't a source of pleasant feelings, but it was all right. It was okay because there was no dukkha. The dukkha was not present.
Yeah. And Rick also says, I've become more aware that intense pain causes strong cravings and a compulsion to use food, diet, soft drinks, or spending money to cope. When I reduce the pain, these cravings fall away. Yeah, actually, it's as the Buddha said. The Buddha in the suttas, he says that beings who don't know a higher escape only know sensual pleasure as an escape from dukkha. I forget exactly how he phrases it. You know the quote I'm talking about. Yeah. So actually recognizing that's completely normal. When we're experiencing a lot of dukkha, then we start looking for some sukha to try to cover up the dukkha. So that's totally normal. So you can recognize that it's natural that this is what you tend to do, because actually that's what all unenlightened beings tend to do. And also recognizing that as you cultivate your Buddhist practice, that you're starting to discover another way of dealing with pain, which does not necessitate going after sensual pleasure. But in the meantime, it's like, yeah, okay, when it gets really overbearing, you go and you have a diet soft drink. I think that's not really the end of the world. It's understandable. And also recognize that if you cultivate Buddhist practice, then eventually you won't need to rely upon those things.
Yeah, I feel like, we can see this, that tendency of mine so strongly, especially if we get mosquito bites, where it starts itching so badly that even though we understand that by scratching the skin, it will make it worse, we can't help ourselves from doing it. And so we start scratching it. If we got like lots of mosquito bites, we might even like start bleeding. And it just like, it's kind of like almost never ending, that like sort of itchiness, and having that relief while scratching the thing, and also like increasing the dukkha. But then sometimes we're capable of actually overcoming that urge to scratch. And then we see that, the sort of really unpleasant sensation of the mosquito bite or bites at a certain point, has its course. Like, there is the unpleasant feeling, And then, as your point, the unpleasant feeling is also impermanent. And so then it subsides. And so we're actually relinquishing the desire to scratch. So most of it, I feel like it's, when, as we are practitioners, a lot of the practice is actually observing how our mind works. And without judging us too much in terms of like, oh, bad practitioner, oh, you're like, doing this or that, but rather like observing how we are constantly going to sort of sensual pleasures to release the suffering, but sometimes we actually make it worse. And how instead sometimes we're successful and we relinquish the desire for the our experience to be different, and actually the suffering subsides. But it is counterintuitive. The Dhamma is counterintuitive, and so most of the time I feel like it's really observing how how essentially our behavior, that like our intuition tells us to behave in a particular way, actually has the opposite result than the one that we're expecting. And then just also like we understand that it's just part of the practice. It's just part of like the experience of an unenlightened being, and each one of our conditions is not terribly different from the other. It might look on the surface that might be different. We're all having different sort of types of dukkha, but it's still dukkha. There's still one name for it. And there's still only one cause of dukkha. And so we start seeing, stop taking it too personally, stop taking it to also, we stop thinking that we're failing perhaps at the practice of Dhamma, but rather going, oh, these are really strong habits that it's difficult to overcome. And we're like, okay, oh, little cutie, you got you got trapped in that that habit again. Oh, it's okay, we'll do better next time.
And Richard says, what are the karmic merits from recognizing but not clinging to these 8 worldly conditions as self, and instead seeing them as simply arising and ceasing? Well, full awakening. And that's the end result of this kind of practice. It leads to full awakening. And in the short term, it leads to a much happier and more peaceful state of mind. So short term, more happiness and peace. Long term, full awakening. And Joseph says, when tunnel vision happens in anger, one seems to be concentrated poorly. Is this related to what you said about samadhi being panoramic awareness and stillness? Well, whenever the mind is angry, then it's far from samadhi. The Buddha says as much. Often when we're experiencing anger, then the mind is in a narrow state because it's fixating only on what we dislike. So it's not seeing the bigger picture, and it's also not recognizing the amount of pain that we're causing to ourselves, and also the fact that we're actively cultivating the path to unawakening. That is a narrow-mindedness. So putting that as the opposite of the panoramic stillness of samadhi, I think that's one way of looking at it. Yeah. And Sud says, is it correct to think that this type of noble one's equanimity, achievable or achievement of higher levels of metta? For example, in the Sa Sutta, the Buddha states that we should be like space or earth, or like a big body of water. Basically, nothing sticks in space. Can't make earth be like earth, etc. Seems like it's a deeper level of metta. Is it correct to think so? Well, it's equanimity. And that's what the Buddha is describing there. So calling equanimity a deeper level of metta or a higher level of metta, I've heard some teachers talk about it that way, but that's not quite how the Buddha talks about it. But the 4 Brahmaviharas are all interrelated. So there is a relationship between equanimity and metta. What are your thoughts on this?
That I don't quite understand actually the question.
So he's asking if this type of equanimity, so equanimity towards the 8 worldly conditions, is like a higher form of metta or a deeper level of metta.
I don't know.
Would you say, Bhante, it's a deeper level that the Brahma Viharas, like, always view, although they're all interrelated, I always view like equanimity as going deeper, even further as metta develops fully, or as it becomes stronger, then other Brahma Viharas get strengthened.
I mean, I tend to think of the four in the sequence as being progressively more subtle and progressively more difficult. But I do think of all four as being distinct mind states. So to me, metta and equanimity are distinctly different things. Yeah. But of the two, equanimity is the more subtle and the more challenging. And practicing metta will support the practice of equanimity, and also vice versa. Practicing equanimity supports the practice of metta. But in my mind, they are distinctly separate things. They're not, it's not that one is a higher form of the other.
Yeah, I feel like metta practice supports all of this, but it's not like a higher form of metta. I feel like they're also distinguished for a reason. Precisely, that's my understanding as well, that it's they are for Brahma Viharas, for different houses, you know, and they all like create a town or a neighborhood, you know, but so you can speak of the, yeah, me too. That's quite nice. But yeah, so like you can speak of it, of course, you know, that neighborhood is comprised of those four houses, but there's still four distinguished houses. That's how I see it. So it's not that like one house is the superior form of the other one. Like it's more that together they support each other in creating the neighborhood.
Yeah. And let's see, Scott says, I love to meditate on mosquito bites. Great practice as the pain or itch transforms, but I do regret it if I allow myself to become a total smorgasbord. Yeah, I mean, you don't need to go out of your way to seek more pain in your life. Life usually throws enough pain at us as it is. So our practice is to be peaceful with the pain that comes, but we don't need to deliberately seek out more. I'm a fan of insect repellent, personally. The non-toxic kind.
And Joseph has
doing this one.
The last one, I think there's another one. Can't see it.
Joseph says, Bhante Analio mentioned in an interview, concentration on the breath made him more angry as an anger type, too concentrated and focused on the breath. Yeah, I mean, sometimes what happens is that we, while cultivating a wholesome state of mind, like samadhi, we are inadvertently also cultivating an unwholesome state of mind. And when we recognize that that's what we're doing, that we've somehow managed to conjoin both a wholesome development and an unwholesome development, then it's necessary to change up what we're doing. So that's not unique to Bhante and Alio. So actually another example of this is some people, while doing Asubha meditation, they find that their lust is increasing rather than decreasing. So sometimes you do a practice which you think is going to improve your state of mind, but it winds up actually worsening it. Or it winds up both improving and damaging your wholesome states at the same time. So you realize that something you're doing with your mind is increasing a wholesome state, but also increasing an unwholesome state. So when you recognize these things, then that's a sign that we need to do something different, that we need to change up our practice so that we can increase our wholesome states without increasing our unwholesome states. So it's, yeah, I mean, these things can certainly happen. But then other people, concentration on the breath makes them less angry. So it's not always going to be the case that concentration increases anger. And he goes on, how do we practice opening up and in clenching from the object of anger like a dog with a locked jaw? Actually, the Buddha's basic recommendation is if something brings up your dosa, then don't pay attention to it. Put your mind elsewhere.
Yeah, and then also developing the mind with the Brahma Viharas in particular, obviously metta. But yeah, it's very interesting because I always found that very interesting how the Buddha recommends, for example, if like our mind tends towards, really kind of finding, like, we look at the mark of the beautiful in everything, like, so we find the experience of samsara really delicious, to actually focus on the drawbacks. But if our mind tends to look at the drawbacks of everything, like tends towards irritation, towards anger, he doesn't actually recommend to develop the opposite, to develop the mark of the beautiful, but rather he says, no, just develop your mind. So there's that's kind of tension, I feel like, of actually having an understanding of like the sort of unsatisfying aspect of the samsaric experience, and not falling into depression and distress and anger. But there is that kind of tension where there is, a kind of factor of wisdom that arises, where we're like, oh, this is actually not as great as I thought it was, kind of like, perhaps maybe sometimes I feel like there's also a little bit of wisdom mixed in the confusion after, like, say if we've eaten, the whole like kind of like can of ice cream or whatever. And then we're like, oh, this actually feels horrible. And like we regret our action. And there's that understanding of like the dukkha, of the sukha, right? It's just that then we don't develop our mind. We don't take into consideration. And either we repeat the pattern hoping to have sukha, even though it never worked in the past and it's not going to work this time again at all, or we get depressed and we're like, wow, not even ice cream helps. This is just really horrible. And I feel like there's that tension, though, of recognizing the dukkha, and then if you develop the mind, then you're not depressed by, you're not angry about the sort of condition of samsara. You're not like, oh, wow, this is just so awful, I wish it was different. You're kind of like, oh, I understand, it's just the way it is. Like, this is it. This is what it is.
And Bill says, to deal with anger in meditation, I believe you once said to just be nice to others. Yeah, so it's important to remember that we are training our mind every single waking moment. So if you want your mind to have less anger during meditation, well, then be nice when you're not meditating. Be nice to people all the time. And what you're doing is basically training the mind to be nice. And then during meditation, that will be its default state. So this is one reason why cats are very supportive to one's meditation practice, is because they will constantly remind you to practice metta. They constantly remind you to keep a wholesome state of mind, so that then one is less likely to fall into dosa.
They also help you while you're meditating, because they usually like sit on your lap and then you can't move. So it's perfect. It's great. So yeah, if you live close to New Jersey, we can do a PSA. Currently, Empty Cloud Monastery is fostering a cat who is really adorable and sweet. So if you want to improve your metta practice, you can come and meet him at Empty Cloud Monastery and practice with him, and possibly also request to the rescue group to foster him. And if you don't live next to Empty Cloud Monastery, you can go to your local shelter or rescue group and either foster or adopt a kitty.
Great.
Or a dog. Yeah, well, the dogs are a little bit less friendly with meditation. They like to hop around.
Yeah. Cats are usually a bit more meditative. Richard asks, do the pairs of the 8 worldly conditions always arise and cease in unison, or do they operate differently based on the existing conditions? I would say they operate differently based on the conditions. So they don't always arise in unison. Usually one of them is going to be dominant in any particular moment. They don't always come in pairs. They don't always arise simultaneously. And Scott has a question, but I think it's a bit off topic, so I think that's better saved for mug chat.
I mean, well, it is kind of somewhat related. I think it's okay.
If you want to take it.
I mean, I don't know if I quite understand it, to be quite frank, but so maybe you can address it. But would you mind speaking on the idea man is condemned to be free?
Well, first off, I also don't understand what that means. It doesn't sound even remotely Buddhist to me. So it just kind of glances off the surface of my mind. So honestly, I don't really understand what that quote means.
Maybe if you can, Scott, if you can give us some context on where that is from, and if it's from the suttas, where it's in the suttas. So maybe it might be an odd translation of something that is in the suttas.
Sounds more like something from Western philosophy.
Well, we don't know, but
yeah.
We can ask.
Okay. And Sud says, I feel like as I am practicing metta, I am less reactive to praise and blame. Perhaps equanimity and metta are two different things, but it seems like they're somehow related. Yeah, definitely. As I mentioned earlier, they, again, they're both Brahma-viharas, and all four Brahma-viharas are interrelated and also mutually supportive. So as you practice more metta, then yes, your equanimity will also become stronger. That's true.
Yeah.
So that's to be expected. Yeah. And that's the last question from online. So maybe that's enough for the evening.
Mm-hmm. Yes, yeah. Unless Scott sends the clarification of what they were talking about. I'm not sure. Maybe we can give it 2 more seconds.
Otherwise, Scott, you're welcome to bring your question to Mug Chat tomorrow evening, and we can discuss it in more detail then.
Yes, maybe that would be best. And if you can't, okay, Scott says it's from the philosopher Sartre.
The idea is that there's a burden associated with needing to make choices.
There is a burden associated with needing to make choices. Actually, Sartre used to be one of my favorite philosophers back in the day, so I should know what this is. I just know it in Italian probably. So
yeah,
man is content to be free. So like the sort of condemnation of making choices.
No, because actually I think that like part of the Buddha's point is that we have the ability to choose to become awakened. We have the ability to choose to not suffer. We have the ability to choose to be kind and wise. So that doesn't actually strike me as being a burden per se. I would say existence at all is a burden. That would definitely be Buddhist. But particularly having the ability to make choices actually strikes me as a good thing, because we can choose to become free of suffering.
Yeah, I think it's a burden when we don't have the Dhamma that guides us in understanding what is kusala from akusala. So what is wholesome versus what is unwholesome. So we tend to have all sorts of weird ideas of what is wholesome, what is unwholesome, which is based perhaps on like our, just personal ideas or likes, dislikes, or, cultural conditioning, what our family parents told us and so forth. And then it becomes a burden because we're most often than not making bad choices that lead to bad consequences. And then there comes the whole regret and the stress and dukkha. But I feel like that is what, as Bhante mentioned, it's the best thing, sort of like basically the sort of nuts and bolts of Buddhism, the fact that we're actually capable of eliminating suffering altogether, that the elimination of dukkha is possible is because we can make the choice, we can make choices. So it's actually, it stops. I think it transforms what we can perceive as a burden as something that empowers us, because all of a sudden we're not the victims of the world. We don't have to just suck it up, and we don't have to like try to decide, what is the less of the worst evils, or, whatever it is. But rather we're like, oh, okay, I can follow this path and I can make choices that lead towards the cessation of suffering.
And Joseph asks, is Mudita and Karuna related to the 8 worldly concerns? Wishing for the 4 gains to increase in others and wishing for the 4 losses to increase in others. And equanimity is everyone knows their actions. Yeah, that's actually lines up pretty neatly. Yeah, that seems pretty reasonable to me. Yeah. Yeah. And that's the last of the questions. So I think we can go ahead and conclude at this time with 3 more sadhus. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu.
And thank you all for joining and for sharing all these like beautiful comments and asking all these like really good questions. This tonight was really fun, and thank you for your comment differences, Pradin. Very kind.
Okay.
All right, may you be well and happy. May all good things come to you.